What's up everybody, it's Joe with J Blake Photo, and in today's video we're going to be talking about what 2022, right, 2020 version 2 has in store for Apple and the M series processors and what kind of products that's gonna give us. We're gonna be talking about some of the recent rumors and also some of the leaks and honestly some of the common sense stuff that we should expect here in 2022 from now the first $3 trillion company. Okay, before we get into the video about Apple and all the fun stuff that we're gonna be seeing in 2022, a quick plug for the channel. I'd really appreciate it if you go ahead and hit the subscribe button and if you go ahead and hit the like button. And when you do, if you can go ahead and hit the bell so that you're notified when I make new videos. I'm pushing really hard to get to 10,000 subscribers. I'm super close. I'm within, I think, 40 or 50. So please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. And if you're into stills photography, this is a photography channel. And I am a Mac user, which is why I like talking about Apple and Mac products. But if you are into stills photography, go ahead and find me over on Instagram. I'm at jblakePhoto, and I'll be posting photos from some of my photo adventures. Speaking of photo adventures, I'm gonna be posting the part 2 of my trip out to Mammoth Lakes, California. But part 1 is linked down below, and I'll put a card right up here. I'd really appreciate it if you check that out and let me know what you're thinking. That's it. We're done with the plugs for the channel. Now let's talk about Apple and what we're gonna see in 2022. Okay, in this video, we're not really gonna be talking much about, iPads or iPhones or anything like that. We're gonna be talking specifically about Macintosh computers. I am currently using the 14-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro. Oh, that is a mouthful, and I love it. It has been a phenomenal laptop thus far for me. But when we talk about 2022, or we talk about really anything that is coming in the lineup for Macintosh products, we can't not talk about the processors that are going to be in them. So let's start by talking about what we think the M1 Pro Plus Max Duo will be. Okay, if you watched my previous video where I talked about the Intel 12th generation Alder Lake processors, their big little configuration, and whether or not they could take on the new M1 Max from Apple, you saw me get into a deep dive on the scalability and flexibility of that processor. I'm not gonna go into all of that in this video, but I will say this, that the cores inside of the M1 Max, M1 Pro are the same as what's inside the M1, which are the same that are inside of the A14 Bionic. That's the processor that we saw in 2020's Apple iPhone 12 and 12 Pro and 12 Pro Max. This is the iPhone 13 Pro Max, and it has the A15 Bionic. More on that in the second half of the video. But we're still talking about 2020 chips here, and we saw them in the M1 in the MacBook Air. We saw them in the M1 in the Mac Mini. We saw them in the M1 in the MacBook Pro. And then we saw the M1 Max and M1 Pro in the MacBook Pro 14 and 16-inch revisions that we saw at the end of last year, which is where this laptop comes from. So I have every reason to believe that we will be seeing a slate of products that are based on this same processor, meaning we will have the same Ice Storm and Firestorm cores, Firestorm being your P cores, your performance cores, Ice Storm being your E cores, your efficiency cores. We will be seeing the same revisions of these cores in new products in the first half of 2022, probably in the spring. But what will we be seeing in the spring of 2022, in this first half of 2022 from Apple that will have the M1 processor in it? So first of all, they're gonna take the M1 Max, right? This is a 10-core CPU with 2 efficiency cores and 8 performance cores, along with 16 cores of neural engine and up to 32 cores of graphics processor. And I think we're gonna get 2 new flavors of this processor. We're actually going to get 2 different versions of it. Version 1, and I don't know exactly what this thing is gonna be called. They could call it the Max Plus, they could call it the Max, probably something along the lines of a Duo and a Quadro. They may come up with different marketing for that, maybe Ultra, or Epic or something along those lines. But basically what you're gonna have are two different flavors of this chip. One being a 2-die processor and one being a 4-die processor. So within the M1 Max, there is fabric in, a connection between the processors, between the cache, between the graphics chips, between those components and between the memory and the SSD that is extremely fast. It is the fastest that we've ever seen in a personal computer system. It's faster than what we currently have on chip with Intel because it doesn't have to go across the motherboard. It doesn't have to go through any sort of a controller chip. It's inside that system on a chip, right? That's the advantage of having all of that in one package. We're likely going to get a second package here. They likely will not actually build a 114 billion transistor single die. The reason for that is because it creates manufacturing nightmares. You're more likely to run into problems where that chip will have defects and parts of it won't function properly. You're way better off just printing two and gluing them together. But the glue that they use here is very, very fast. So you effectively get two chips that act as one. They're still not as fast as one, but they're very close. So effectively we can take this chip and just double it, right? So we go from 10 cores to 20. So you'll end up with, instead of 8 performance cores, you'll end up with 16 performance cores. Instead of 2 high efficiency cores, you're gonna end up with 4 high efficiency cores. You'll go from 16 core neural engine up to a 32 core neural engine, and you'll go from a max of 32 cores of graphics processing hardware up to 64 cores, effectively just doubling everything across the board. You'll also likely get double access to RAM, so you'll go from a max of 64 gigabytes that's currently available up to 128 gigabytes. So with the M1 Max Duo, we'll call it, you'll end up with a maximum 20 core processor, CPU processor, 64 core GPU, and up to 128 gigabytes of RAM. I doubt that they'll offer a lot of different versions of this chip, though they might offer a slightly slimmed down version, since again, they will be able to effectively glue these together. If you had one chip that had a defect, you could pair it with another chip that had a defect and have a 10 core, or 16 core and a 48 core GPU. There's a lot of different versions that you could do there, and I don't know where they are in their efficiency in the manufacturing process to say whether or not that would be something they would offer, or they would just offer this in the Duo flavor. So you've got the Duo flavor, and then they're gonna add what I think is gonna be called the Quadro or a quad flavor or Max Plus Plus or whatever. But this will be effectively 2 of those, again, glued together. So 4 of these Max chips glued together, which then puts you at 40 cores, which is 40 cores, meaning that you would have 32 cores effectively of CPU. So 32 Firestorm cores, along with 8 of the Ice Storm cores. 8 of those 8 of the efficiency cores and 32 of the performance cores for a total of 40 cores. You would have a 40 core CPU. In that version, then you would also be able to have up to 128 cores of graphics processors. So you have 32 on each die, with each die glued together. And each die would have its own cache and its own, instruction controller and all that sort of thing, which we'll talk about in just a second. The other thing that you would get, again, doubled is access to RAM. So now you go from having a maximum of 128 gigabytes of RAM to 256 gigabytes of RAM. Now that's not as much as the 1.5 terabytes of RAM or something that you could add to the Mac Pro when it was first introduced. They may have other ways for you to add additional RAM in other chassis, but we'll talk about that in just a second. So now we've got these 2 different sets of chips. We've got the Max Duo and the Max Quadro with effectively doubling and then quadrupling the power of the M1 Max. By itself, that is an extremely powerful CPU-GPU combo. and not really taking a whole lot of power. You got to figure that that Duo chip is probably going to pull somewhere between 90 and 150 watts. For the Quadro or four-way version of the chip with 4 dies put together, the Max Plus Plus, I think you're looking at somewhere between a 180 and a 400 watt chip. But again, it's not likely going to be pulling that kind of power unless you are maxing it out all the time. And I think that the one thing that's really going to be the most important in the release of these chips, in the release of products that are based on these chips, is actually not going to be the chips themselves, but it's going to be the kind of thread handling that Apple puts into macOS. So we'll likely need to see an update to macOS that will include thread handling for this many dies. So whether or not you have RAM that is individually allocated on each die and how much each individual CPU can access the RAM on another CPU, or if it's just locked to that CPU, if you've got a single thread that's running on one chip that's super high bandwidth and it needs a lot of RAM, will it be able to access more than the 64 gigabytes that's on its chip? Will it be able to access the other 128 or more that are available on the other 2 or 3 chips? And how does macOS handle that? How does it distribute those resources? How fast is that fabric going to be between those chips? And will we see performance hiccups or any sort of drop-offs as we expand to more and more threads, more and more processors being used with more and more saturation of the memory on the chip? Those are things that we look at really closely when we look at really, really big chips, like the enthusiast chips out of Intel and the super high core count Ryzen chips, the Threadripper style chips that we have, and the EPYC chips and Xeon chips that we have. That'll definitely be something that we'll have to look very closely at. But I do believe that in the next 6 months we will see 4 and 2 core versions of these Macs, of these M1 Max chips put together, all still based on the same core processor technology. Okay, so first half of the year, we get a chip upgrade. What products will this unlock? And I think that there are 2 in particular that we are going to be seeing. One is an iMac Pro. So right now we have the 27-inch iMac that has been discontinued, the iMac Pro, that was based on Intel architecture. It had, I think it had Xeon chips in it. It was super hot, but it was high power, and Apple had to release that product as a response to the fact that the trash can Mac Pro really didn't do what it needed to do for professionals. And so they released the iMac Pro and then subsequently the Mac Pro to be able to really kind of satiate the need of pros out. But since then, we've seen the M1s, the M1 Pro, the M1 Max, and now we have an iMac, the 24-inch iMac, that has a single M1 processor in it that is effectively no different from what you have in the MacBook Pro 13-inch or the Mac Mini or the MacBook Air. Now, the MacBook Air is one difference in that it has no cooling versus the iMac that does. And I think if you look at the 4 products there, the iMac has the most cooling of those products. So what I would anticipate is a chassis very similar to what we have in the new updated M1 Mac, larger with a higher quality display, similar to what we currently have on the MacBook Pro, specifically with the Liquid Retina XDR display that we have on the MacBook Pros. There are some rumors going back and forth as to whether or not it will actually have that type of screen. I'd be really disappointed if it didn't. This is marketed as a full size, whether it's 27 or 30 or 32-inch iMac, and it doesn't have that super high dynamic range display with 1,000+ nits of brightness, 1,000 local dimming zones. Then I don't know, I'll be personally disappointed because I have been blown away by this screen. It is probably one of my favorite components or features on the 14-inch MacBook Pro is this screen. And to see it in 27+ inches would really be phenomenal. So hopefully at under $3,000, we can see a 27-inch version. Maybe it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, maybe it doesn't get as bright, but close. In the iMac Pro. along with what I think will be the options to configure it with either an M1 Max and an M1 Max Duo. I don't think that they would put the quad version of the chip in there. I think the Duo will be about as high as it goes, because I don't really think that they're going to want to push that much cooling into a chassis and still try to keep it as thin, effectively as thin as an iPad, which is what it is right now. Okay, so what else will we see in the first half of 2022 that will incorporate these new dual and quad versions of the M1 Max processor? And I think the next one is pretty obvious. It's going to be a Mac Pro. There are so many different ways that they can go with this, and I think we might even see multiple versions of it. But here's what I know for sure, is that it will have this quad version and probably the Duo version as different configuration options. So you might have the Duo with up to 128 gigabytes of RAM and the quad with up to 256, and variations a little bit up and down. And then of course you'll be able to add additional storage and that sort of thing. I do believe that there will be an option to add DDR5 on the motherboard. I think Apple will allow pros to max out this device with DDR5, though it won't be as accessible as the on-chip memory. I think they will allow professional users to expand their Mac Pros with this device. And I still think that they're going to allow you to add additional afterburner cards. Maybe not with PCI Express slots, but I think we may still see RISC-based chips that they can program and modify to get on there to have additional encode decodes. Now remember, the M1 Max has two encode decode blocks for ProRes and for other media encoders like VP9, H.265, H.264, HEVC. Multiply that by 4, right? So you've got two ProRes decode and two ProRes encode blocks. Now you have 8 of each of those. The render speeds that you'll be able to, it's just going to be amazing. The workflow capability will just be phenomenal. And I think these things are going to scream for video editors. Not to mention the number of cores that you're going to see on the 3D side of things for things like, 3D design, and even maybe game creation, if we can get some version of a proper game engine running on Mac OS that actually uses metal. But I know that that's a pipe dream, which is why Apple needs to buy a game studio. But I'll talk about that in another video. So you may have two versions of this Mac Pro. One may come in something more like a Mac Mini style, where you have the kind of dual core or the Duo version of the M1 Max with some additional cooling, the significantly lower cost, and then an expandable version that includes all the way up to the quad version, all the way up to 256 gigabytes of on SoC memory, additional expandability with DDR5, maybe additional expandability with PCI Express cards. Pros need that stuff. They need to be able to add in their own cards based on what they're going to be doing. And I definitely think that that's something that Apple will continue to offer them in that larger chassis. But imagine a Mac Pro with a 40 core M1 Max processor, 4 of those M1 Max processors in there, and 256 gigabytes of RAM, 8 terabytes. It's going to cost $9,000, but I think that's going to be a phenomenal machine for pros, and they're going to buy it, and it's going to work really well for them. All right, so now moving on to the second half of 2022, right? So we're talking about things like summer after WWDC, we're talking about September iPhone announcement, and we're talking about an October announcement-ish, depending on how things go. If Apple plays their cards right and they can get an announcement in June or July about updated MacBooks, specifically the MacBook Air, with new processors, I think they'll be able to hit the back-to-school market, and I think that this will help them from a strategic perspective. They don't normally do that. They somehow tend to miss that mark because they don't really seem to care. But I think from a shareholder perspective, I would think that that would be something that they could do and do really well at. But the products are driven by the chips. So what chips are we going to see? Well, I think for sure we're going to end up seeing an M2. And you might say, well, you just said there's going to be this huge beefy upgrade to the M1 Max. Why would they then just release an M2 right after that? Why not create an M2 and then make that one super huge and beefy? Because the M2 is not going to be a significant improvement in performance, or power over the M1. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you recall back to my previous video where I talked about the M1 and the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, those chips are based on the 2020 iPhone 12 processor, the A14 Bionic. The A14 Bionic has the Firestorm and Ice Storm cores based on ARM designs. The A15 Bionic that comes in the Apple iPhone 13, those are based on different cores. Those are based on Avalanche and Blizzard cores. They're hot, cold cores, effectively. So they are extremely powerful, but they run at lower power levels. They're designed to run with less power usage and not as much more bandwidth, right? So it's not so much a faster chip as it is a slightly faster chip that takes a lot less power. Imagine that they release specifically a MacBook Air and maybe even a MacBook, just a plain MacBook, with this new M2 chip. This new M2 chip, of course, will support up to 16 gigabytes of RAM, and it will likely have up to a 10-core GPU with probably a 4 and 4 or 6 and 4 10-core CPU configuration. But those 6 P cores and 4 E cores will not be the cores from the M1. They will be the cores from the A15 Bionic. They will be the Avalanche and Blizzard cores, which means you will not see significant improvements in performance in terms of sheer horsepower, right? You won't see a lot more, but what you will see is a significant improvement in battery life. So the Ice Storm and Firestorm cores were very powerful, but the Avalanche and Blizzard cores are just as powerful, not just a little bit more, but with slightly less battery usage. So you get a MacBook or a MacBook Air with exactly the same performance plus 10 or 20%, plus another 20 or 30% graphics performance as they add more cores, maybe even more CPU performance with more of those cores as well, because I'm estimating that they're going to go to 6 cores on that chip, and you will end up with maybe 30 to 40% more battery life. And that is where Apple wants to go. They don't need to make the MacBook Air more powerful. It doesn't need to be faster. It doesn't need to be able to render things or, export video or compile code or import photos into Lightroom or run filters in Photoshop. That's not really that's not what that laptop is for. That laptop is for general productivity, ultra portability, long battery life, content consumption. And I think that we will definitely see in the new MacBook Air and potentially a MacBook, probably around the 12-inch side of things, we will see definitely a M2 with lots and lots of battery life. At the same time, you're going to see MagSafe 3, you're going to see Thunderbolt 4. I don't know if you'll see an SD card slot and an HDMI port, but you'll definitely see those other ports showing up. You'll see an improved screen. And I think they're going to get back to that on the consumer side, which is what this M2 chip will be for. It's for consumer products. Whereas the future down the line, maybe towards the end of 2023, we end up seeing an M2 Max or M2 Pro chip with with more of that productivity focused capability. This is going to be the second half of 2022 is going to be specifically for consumer related products. And then also probably we'll see a iPad, though maybe not until early 2023. We may see an iPad Pro with the M2, which again will just slightly increase the power and significantly increase the battery life. So on the Mac side of things, 2022, we're going to get iMac Pro with a duo configured M1 Max and probably a single configured M1 Max up to 128 gigabytes of RAM. We're also probably going to see 2 versions of a Mac Pro, a small version and a large version. The smaller version probably only offering the duo, kind of a headless iMac, maybe even in a slightly modified Mac Mini configuration in terms of size. I don't know how much of a puck it will be. And then we'll also get the large chassis that will give us access to expandability and all the ports and the giant power supply. And that one will have up to the quad configured M1 Max with 4 dies glued together. That's the first half of 2022. Second half of 2022, we will see the M2 processor come out in the MacBook Air, probably in a redesigned chassis, maybe up to 14-inch screen, completely redesigned and improved, as well as potentially a MacBook, just a MacBook, in a 12-inch version, ultra light, lots of battery life, both of them running that M2 processor, both of them likely fanless, and both based on that Blizzard Avalanche core combo that we have in the current A15 Bionic. And don't forget, in September, October of 2022, we will see the new A16 out of the iPhone 14. And that will be the indicator, right? That is the bellwether for what our roadmap will look like going forward in Macintosh products. The iPhone, Apple is the iPhone company. Everything goes on the iPhone first, and then we see it later on down the road. Likely all of these products will have big ugly notches on them. I know everybody's gonna hate that. I don't really mind it or see it much, but it will be there likely. And we may see a Mac Mini with an M2 in it in the fall. It may wait until the spring. I don't know. I don't know where they're gonna go with the Mac Mini. I think the price is a little much for only 8 gigabytes of RAM for the entry level on that. I actually just bought one for my dad. It's super fast, it's great. He loves it, everything's working wonderfully, but I think we could do a little bit better considering the fact that it doesn't come with a screen or a keyboard or a mouse or any of that kind of stuff. So that's it for Apple in 2022. Let me know down in the comments what you think about that, whether or not any of these products sound like they are what you're looking for. And again, if you like videos like this where I talk about kind of what's coming down the road so that you can help plan your investments. This is a photography channel, but photographers have to invest in their gear. We have to decide where we're going down the road. We got to decide what we're going to be doing and where we want to put our money. Is it going to go into new gear, new camera, new lenses, iPad, MacBook, iMac, Mac Pro, Mac Mini? What are we going to do this year? What does the budget look like? And lots of small businesses have to make these same choices. So do you as an individual, right? You got to decide whether or not you want the laptop or the desktop, or if you're just going to stick with what you got this year, or if your kid's going off to college and they need a iMac or a MacBook Air. Do you wait until the summer of this year to get them one, or do you get them the one that you can get on the shelf now? I'll tell you right now, if you get off the one off the shelf right now, you're going to be fine. Don't worry about it. Again, I know that there's more coming this year, and I bought my dad a Mac Mini this year, even though it's a year old. It's fine. He's fine. It's great for what he needs it for. So don't worry about buying stuff. If you need something right now, go buy something right now. You're going to be fine. But if you like stuff like this, go ahead and let me know down in the comments. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate it. Trying to hit 10K, almost there. Go ahead and like the video, hit the bell so that you get notified when I send you new videos. Only about 10% of my subscribers have notifications turned on, and only 1% of my subscribers actually are a source of views on my videos. A lot of my subscribers watch my videos, but honestly, with having almost 10,000 subscribers, a lot of my videos only have between 3,000 and 4,000 views. So I know a lot of people aren't watching. So if there's something specific that you would like to see, let me know down in the comments. Also, just one more plug for my video about my trip over to Mammoth Lakes. And I will be uploading part 2 here really soon. I've just been a little behind because I had a kid. So dealing with diaper changes and feeding and all that sort of stuff. But it's a blessing. So we're really happy about that. Anyway, thank you again for watching. Thank you for everyone and your support. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're safe. Wear a mask. Get vaccinated. Get your booster. And I'll see you in the next one.